Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Ed. So today we're going to continue the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, more specifically the work in progress Sega Saturn Core. And you guys have been absolutely enjoying the MiSTer FPGA Core versus real Sega Saturn hardware test, so I figured we'd switch it up and do a little bit of FPGA Core versus emulation. Now do be very well aware, these are just preliminary fun tests because the core is not done, but it's doing such a great job you would think it was in spots. Or get to find involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. But we're doing Sega Rally heads up with Mednafen. That is my preferred Sega Saturn emulator, but if you have a different emulator you want to see, leave me a comment down below and maybe I'll change it up for future videos. Because until the core is done, there's not going to be any definitive versus emulation video. These are just testing what is going on here. And if you take a look at the bottom left hand corner, you will know whether or not it's MiSTer FPGA or Mednafen until we get to the end of the video and I test you to see if you can tell the difference. Because I'm going to tell you right now, these two perform incredibly closely. If this was an actual race, we're talking about a photo finish for the checkered flag. But pay attention to the screen space, pay attention to the effects, where you can see some gaps in the polygons, just because that might indicate to you which one we're looking at later on in the video. But the reality is currently on the work in progress core, Sega Rally is doing absolutely everything perfectly in my opinion. I can't really see any issues with the graphics, with the performance, with the controls. Everything with a standard controller just feels like you're playing real Sega Saturn hardware. So now that we've finished the first stage on MiSTer, we're going to move over to Mednafen, and you will see the logo in the bottom left hand corner of the screen change so you know what you are looking at. And if I didn't put the logos up here and if I didn't keep track of my assets, I would really probably have no idea which was which if I didn't do this back to back and remember how I performed in each race. But you're going to see throughout the entirety of these captures, I'm doing the championship once, I'm going to finish the race in the same place within a second of itself. So basically I'm able to perform the exact same way across both MiSTer FPGA and Mednafen. Now because Mednafen is software emulation, it depends on your system how powerful it is, what you have running in the background. I have an i9 and I close everything before I run these tests, so I do have the ability to be able to go ahead and make sure I'm not running any frames into the ground from latency that way. And if we put the heads up side by side of the locked intro together, it is a frame to frame accurate match. Every single turn, every single camera cut, every single text bump coming in is going to happen on the exact same frame on that intro sequence, both on Mednafen and MiSTer FPGA. I went through and looked at every single hard cut in the camera in engine and every single thing matched up. Every time a text bump comes in, it comes in on the exact same frame, side by side, 1-to-1. So as far as all of the locked off sequences of this game are concerned, whether you're on Mednafen or MiSTer FPGA, they happen exactly the same, at least in my testing environment. And that is a very positive thing. It means you have options because, again, I really don't care which you choose. So long as you're playing Sega Saturn, I am happy. MiSTer FPGA has a lot of upsides versus software emulation, and software emulation being absolutely free definitely has one big upside versus MiSTer FPGA. I'm not here to convince you which one to use. I'm just here to convince you to play more Saturn if you're not playing it already. Now that we're on to the second stage in Mednafen, again, watch the screen space, pay attention to the textures, look for anything that might help you later on down the line identify the guess the source test, because this one I think is going to be seriously down to just flipping a coin and guessing at which one you want. But the great thing is Sega Saturn emulation has come so far, whether it's FPGA replication or software emulation, because for the longest time Saturn emulation was shaky just down to how complex the systems are within the hardware, VDP1, VDP2, and the dual Hitachi CPUs. But Saturn emulation has come a long way in the last maybe 3 to 4 years to the point now where it is an absolutely viable option. Just like FPGA, though it is not a finished product, it does receive updates, so honestly it is still in that work in progress phase. There's really no such thing as an emulator that has completely seen development cease with a finalized version that is perfect. A lot of emulators cease actual programming, but they're not finished in any way, shape, or form. So as we finish the race here on Mednafen, we're going to dial it back to the tunnel sequence, and we're going to go through the same stretch of the track with MiSTer FPGA. And again, pay attention, we finished 7th there with 1:22:01 on the clock. You'll see where we finish when we go over to MiSTer FPGA. But again, the lighting models, all of the textures, all of the polygons, all of the effects, the dirt coming from the tires seems to be one-to-one here on MiSTer FPGA, and that is a testament to just how great these two products truly are. SRG 320 with the Core and the Mednafen team that wrote that. And again, I know there's more than one Saturn emulator out there, so maybe in the future I'll test against some other ones. You will see I bump the wall now and again. This is a game that I play relatively often, but I've never been great at it. So if you're waiting to go down into the comments and say I'm not good at the game, you probably already wrote that, and honestly, it doesn't really bother me all that much whatsoever, because we're here just to test them side by side. So pay attention, we're still in 7th place. We had 1:22:01 on the clock in the last race on Mednafen. And as we come across the finish line here, you're going to see we finish in 7th place, and the time is going to come up, and you're going to see 1:22:89. We're within a second in performance as far as me actually playing the game is concerned, which is just wild to think that at least in my muscle memory I can get that close to replicating the same performance. Now, as a side-by-side comparison, Mednafen on the left and the MiSTer FPGA Core on the right, just get a sense of everything going on. The skybox, all of the graphics, all of the shadows, all of the models, everything here. And again, I just made a little mistake there on Mednafen because I got bumped out of the way. That is what makes these tests so hard to do. They are gameplay, and trying to be one-to-one perfectly accurate with your past performance can be quite difficult if you're not recording inputs, which I don't have the capability to do. But therein lies some of the fun of the testing as well, because there's only so much I'm in control of and everything else is up to chance. For the cutscenes in engine, I can cut frame to frame and make sure everything's lined up and see what happens. But when it actually comes into getting into the game and playing, you have to deal with all of the AI of the driver opponents and everything else going on around you. So I would say I did run out of time a little bit earlier in Mednafen, but that's just down to that car bumping me out of the way, which is how organic these tests can truly be. As we move back over to the MiSTer FPGA source again, this is just absolute perfection. And what I will say, at least for Sega Rally, is whether you want to play Mednafen or whether you want to use the MiSTer FPGA Core or whether you want to use real Sega Saturn hardware, you're getting basically the same experience. And it's so cruel when you see the finish line and just can't get past, because again, I got bumped by another car, which happens a lot. So let's go ahead into the heads-up version just to see if we can find any other differences, because the camera gets closer to the ground and closer to the walls, so you're going to see those polygons distort and basically bend at the edges when we get too close to any sort of wall, which is something that happens on real Sega Saturn hardware as well. But let's just see if it happens the same way, and you will see the background skybox does have some lines down the middle of it, and those are going to be in both sources, so they're both doing the exact same thing, just a way that the skybox works on the Sega Saturn, especially if you're not on analog video. Because as fun as these tests are to do, you will know that if you just play this on a CRT television, it looks a lot softer and it smooths out some of the rough edges of the Saturn. That's just something that we cannot replicate over HDMI, and no, I'm not going to put screen filters over it to try to hide it. I want the best pixel perfect source to be able to compare these two things. So once we go to lap 2, we're going to go for MiSTer FPGA and we're going to go to Mednafen, and you see if you can spot any differences whatsoever. And sorry for bumping the wall too much. I do not play this game in the cockpit view. I'm always third person, so for me, this is not my standard of playing whatsoever as far as the camera view is concerned. But again, I haven't noticed a single thing in this capture that makes me think it's doing anything other than exactly what real Sega Saturn hardware would do. Now that we're crossing the finish line, let's move over to Mednafen on the same hot lap and time trial. And again, you'll see these same lines going through the skybox that you did within the MiSTer FPGA Core. At least you should. YouTube does compress these way more than I ever would, so sometimes some of these fine details I'm looking at are lost to you, and a lot of times you guys notice something that I didn't. Like the last video test on Daytona USA, one member of MiSTer Discord noticed an extra line of pixels on the map that was only like 8 pixels wide. I didn't see it whatsoever, but he was eagle-eyed. You know who you are, and he's going to brag about this on Discord a lot. But that's how much I depend on you, and that ended up being an issue ticket that was issued to GitHub for the Core, so SRG 320 can look into it. That is how granular these tests become, and that's why this is so much fun just to talk about, but also to show you side by side, because it does derive useful information for SRG 320 to look at in the future. But as we go through the cockpit view here in Mednafen, again, I'm just blown away by how good these two sources truly are. And the best thing is you guys have options to play Sega Saturn however you want. I have real hardware, I obviously have a MiSTer, and I obviously have Mednafen as well. But if you have nothing other than Mednafen, know you're getting a great experience with software emulation. Really, at the end of the day, I just want to make sure you guys know how you can play these games and make sure you're still playing them. But here comes the test. I changed the car because we've been using the same vehicle the entire time, so you can't look at that. And this is either MiSTer FPGA or it's Mednafen software emulation. And you need to leave me a comment down below and tell me if you think it is either Mednafen or MiSTer. And honestly, this is probably the hardest test I've ever issued on this series, because honestly, if you get it right, I think you're just guessing. So whatever you guess, leave me kind of show your work down below. Explain why you chose the one you did and give some evidence for that. Otherwise, I'm going to assume you flipped a coin, because honestly, that's what I would do if I was watching this. But that is our first MiSTer FPGA versus software emulation comparison. Again, the core is not done, so these are just for fun. And when the core is finished, I will run one final test where I give a final verdict on which one I would use. But at this point in time, at least for Sega Rally, I really wouldn't care if I was on MiSTer FPGA or software emulation, so long as the controller was good, and I'd be totally fine playing either one. But short of that, we are done, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.